let's not do that.
There's a great emotional hook right at the beginning of Rebel Ridge that immediately gets you hating the villain and rooting for the good guy. But instead of cashing that in right away, director Jeremy Saulnier very effectively builds the tension by first exhausting every option that would have de-escalated the conflict.
Oh. I think he's on the Wikipedia page.
And so then, when our hero, who is played very commandingly here by Aaron Pierce, finally steps up to unleash his righteous fury, it feels more than earned. It feels inevitable. I don't think it's a flawless movie, but I had a lot of fun with this one. It's just a solid, story-driven action thriller, and it's the first of many honorable mentions I have in this end-of-the-year video, in which I reflect back on my favorite movies of 2024 and discuss the 10 works that stood out the most to me. According to my Letterboxd, I saw about 100 movies this year. Not my personal best, but still, so far I felt like 2024 had a lot of movies that, while not necessarily being instant classics, were nevertheless just really good. Movies like Edward Berger's Conclave, which I didn't think broke any new ground, but which was still a well-crafted fusion between a contemplative reflection on faith and the twisty storytelling of a Dan Brown mystery box. Or A Different Man, a great character study on self-hatred, insecurity and misguided desires with a fantastic performance from Sebastian Stan. I also really liked The Promised Land, directed by Nikolai Arcel, an old-school historical epic about power, justice and honor set in the wild Danish heathlands, and starring Mads Mikkelsen as a former soldier turned potato farmer who gets caught up in a political conflict. And speaking of potatoes, if you're at all into food, then definitely go see The Taste of Things, directed by Tran Anh Hung. A wonderful French movie about how love and food and the love for food can become entangled in this greater expression of human passion. There are many more honorable mentions coming up, but I'm going to spread those out over the rest of the video so that I won't bombard you with a long list of titles right at the beginning, and so that we can jump straight into a discussion on the first of my 10 favorite movies of this year, which was Carolee Fargeet's The Substance, the story of an aging star who takes a mysterious substance that generates a younger, more beautiful version of herself.
Take care of yourself.
Watching this in a packed theater was just such a wild experience. It was one of those movies where it really felt like the audience reaction was an intended aspect of the movie's overall soundscape.
So smile!
A lot has obviously been said about how The Substance offers plenty of body horror, provocative images, and how it just overall turns everything up to 11.
That's just the way it is.
But what really fascinated me is how it used that cinematic maximalism not only to convey theme, but also to deliberately mess around with our more instinctive wiring. Because ostensibly The Substance is a story about womanhood, about aging, and about the societal beauty standards and the obsession with youth that make the first two so frustratingly complicated. Told as a kind of twisted fairy tale in which the princess gets everything she wants but has to be home by midnight or else face dire consequences. Explorations like these have always been rather tricky, as it is very easy to end up glorifying the very thing you want to critique. What often goes wrong here, in my view, is that the movie will falsely believe that you can solve an emotional response, such as arousal, by just explaining why that feeling can be harmful, which can be effective to some extent, but I don't think that fully addresses the source of that response. It just adds context to it. And this is where The Substance body horror comes in, because body horror, like beauty and arousal, does reach down to that more primal level. And I think it was exactly by continuously oscillating between those two elements, arousal and disgust, that this movie was so effective. Like, it doesn't tell you how to feel or how to feel about your feeling, but it really fights fire with fire, combats emotion with another conflicting one. And to me, even if it got a little over the top at the end, it was this sort of battlefield of sensations that also elevated The Substance into a more general reflection on the human body and on the contentious relationship we so often have with it. It really made me think about how our bodies are not really ours, in the sense that there's this gap between it and our sense of self, which becomes especially apparent when it exposes its limitations, confronts us with its fragility, its mortality, and which in turn can cause that strange feeling of alienation and even hostility. The Substance is an exclusive Mubi release, and seeing how this video is brought to you by Mubi, I'm happy to be able to offer you an extended free trial by using my personal link, that's mubi.com/likestoriesofold. I also have 2 more honorable mentions that are both streaming exclusively on Mubi. You may have already heard me talk about the first one in previous videos, which is The Settlers. A savage yet captivating story about colonialism and man's general tendency towards violence and destruction, set in the empty beauty of the Chilean mountains. This one almost felt like a Cormac McCarthy novel, very contemplative, very rugged, but nevertheless filled with a strange kind of poetry. The other movie that I really liked is one that I'm gonna save for the end. First, on to the second movie from my best of 2024 list, Anora, directed by Sean Baker. A young sex worker from Brooklyn spends a pleasure-filled week with the son of a Russian billionaire, during which they fall in love and impulsively get married. The Cinderella story, however, is quickly threatened as the Russian family finds out and pressures Annie and Ivan to get their marriage annulled.
We are married. They're gonna have to accept that.
Yeah, I know.
Yes.
Accept that?
That's funny, sure, yeah.
What follows is a fascinating and highly entertaining blend of The Hangover and Uncut Gems, infused with Baker's eye for those existing on the margins of society. I think this might be the funniest movie I've seen this year. It has these almost Tarantino-like sequences where the tension just builds and builds, and every bad situation somehow escalates into an even greater chaos, which is made all the more enjoyable because of the movie's great cast of side characters. At one point Ivan goes missing and Annie has to find him with these Russian goons who are played so wonderfully by their performers.
Where are you going?
The car.
It's 5-minute walk.
No, I'm not walking down there.
It really adds a lot of texture, a lot of vibrancy to this already intense roller coaster. And it also affirms that at the end of the day, Anora is more than just a slapstick comedy. I think it is also a somewhat underappreciated character study. One criticism that I encountered a few times with this movie is that its main character was underdeveloped, and while it is true that we don't get too much by way of backstory, I do believe this doesn't mean Annie was actually lacking in depth. Like, I don't think you have to sit your main character down in front of a mirror in some pensive moment of introspection in order to communicate their interiority. You can also just do that through action, and I think Anora is a fantastic demonstration of how to do that. For it's exactly in that hedonistic fever dream and later in that tense scramble to stop everything from falling apart, where Annie's self-empowerment is in direct conflict with those greater forces of marginalization, that we learn a lot about who she really is, her strengths and weaknesses, her ingenuity and experience, her naivete and delusions, and the way it all feeds into her greater longing for happiness, freedom, and self-actualization. Which is also where the movie ultimately hits that more tragic note as the dream inevitably collapses to reveal the true nature not just of the ravages left behind after Annie's brief escapade, but also of the damage that was there all along. By the way, if you've seen my video on the 50 most life-changing movies ever made, which I really hope you did because I spent all year making it, you know I don't like to do traditional rankings, and the same goes for this list. There's no countdown or anything, but I did think it would be fun to order the movies from high energy to low. You know, The Substance, Anora, they were pretty intense, and we're not going to cool that down just yet, because next up is Challengers, directed by Luca Guadagnino. Challengers is about tennis, but really it's about sex, about masculinity and desirability, and about the complicated interrelationships that arise between these competing elements. But what probably fascinated me most about this movie is how it is about these subjects, for Guadagnino presents his strange love triangle with a kinetic energy that propels us back and forth in time, as if connecting us to the emotional flow that intensifies when past feelings emerge back in the present. I also especially loved the music here and how it is employed in unexpected moments and unexpected ways, cutting in and out in seemingly innocuous moments. It really gave me that feeling of deeper emotions rising and raging beneath the surface. In this sense, the movie is not just highly entertaining with its high-energy presentation, but also offers a meaningful reflection of how our consciousness, our entire sense of self, is always grounded in history, with the past reverberating into the present where it, at least in part, shapes our actions in conscious and unconscious ways as we are infused with old traumas, fears, and desires. It really communicates that idea that adulthood is just one big attempt to rectify the wounds of our youth, which is also what makes the main characters so compelling. None of them are particularly sympathetic, they all clearly have their flaws. In fact, I think it is fair to say that they are, each in their own way, very problematic, but the point is that we at least come to understand where they are coming from, what is driving them, what has them so conflicted and frustrated. And I think it's in achieving that knowledge that, in the end, the movie nevertheless finds some semblance of victory. While we're on the subject of Joss O'Connor and Italian filmmaking, I also want to mention La Camera.
No, grazie.
A strange, almost otherworldly tale about an archaeologist stuck in what feels like a sort of limbo between past and present, beauty and value, and life and death. I'm not yet fully sure what to make of this one, but it was definitely entrancing.
Can you hold this?
2024 was also the year that M. Night Shyamalan released Trap, which was quite a divisive movie, but which I actually find myself really enjoying as this Hitchcockian thriller that knows how to have fun with its own rather silly premise, while still touching on some deeper, almost psychoanalytical themes about masculinity and about fatherhood in particular. I haven't seen too many people talk about this yet, but that idea of a man split in two, light and dark, the aspirational and the repressed, I thought was pretty interesting. Similarly, I was also fascinated by Francis Ford Coppola's grand personal project, Megalopolis, which I wasn't able to see until earlier this month and which actually grabbed me more than I was expecting. In many ways, it's a movie that almost defies analysis, but I do know that at least on an emotional level, I actually found it quite moving at times. There's just a deep vulnerability to the way Coppola lays out his fears for our world and its future, and a great sincerity in his appeal for hope and for the importance of art, for beauty, for some ideal that is not just valuable now, but forever.
We are such stuff as dreams are made on!
Now, I really enjoyed Furiosa. I think it was a compelling portrait not just of the titular character, but just as much, if not more so, of the Mentis, who struck me as this total embodiment of senseless brutality, reflexively inciting chaos and misery around him in this futile attempt to relieve his inner brokenness.
We need more, and each time we need more until too much is never enough. We are the already dead.
It really made for a much more tragic story than the first movie, but luckily George Miller still had it in him to make it epic, as Furiosa also had some of the most electrifying action set pieces I've seen all year. But, having said that, for me, the ultimate desert saga, my #1 blockbuster experience of 2024, still is the second chapter of Denis Villeneuve's Dune. And yes, I know I said this list wasn't ranked, but Dune Part 2 was just on a whole other level for me. Probably the best thing I can say about it is that it's just completely immersive. Like, I think I've seen it 3 or 4 times at this point, and each time I forget I'm watching a movie, I'm just fully transported into this world which Villeneuve has adapted with such tangibility and such grandeur. It actually gets better with each viewing because of this. Because once you get more familiar with all the plot beats, you can really let yourself get lost in all the little details that give it texture, and just vibe with the impeccable atmosphere. Also a shout out to Hans Zimmer here for delivering yet another incredible score.
What we do for the benefit of all.
Well, I'd very much like to be equal to you.
Dune Part 2 covers the second half of the original novel, and in doing so was much awaited to bring the open-endedness of the first movie full circle. And even though the story isn't yet fully over, we're still getting Messiah. I do believe Villeneuve perfectly stuck the landing here, not just with regards to getting right the thematic essence of Paul's corrupted ascension, of him embracing his role as a false prophet to ultimately incite a holy war, but also when it comes to really making this gradual descent emotionally resonant. There is this palpable sense of tragic inevitability that can be felt throughout the story as Paul is faced with this impossible situation in which it seems like he has nowhere to go but ruin, forced to either perish or become monstrous.
But I do see a way. There is a narrow way through.
And it actually made me feel quite sympathetic towards him, and also especially towards Chani, who gets caught up in this conflicted relationship between following her heart and trying to ensure the survival of her people. As such, it's only fitting, and in my opinion a sign that Villeneuve hit the exact right notes here, that the ending first and foremost leaves you with a feeling of sorrow, not just out of grief for what has been lost, but also as if you're already mourning that which is still to come. I have to admit, I haven't been keeping up with Clint Eastwood's work in the last few years, but Juror 2 was a good reminder that maybe I should have been. For despite being in his 90s, Eastwood still knows how to make a damn good movie. Juror 2 is a classic moral dilemma in a way that I don't think we've seen in a long time. A man is selected to serve as a jury member on a murder case where he quickly realizes that he is actually the one who, albeit unknowingly and accidentally, killed the victim.
What are you telling me?
Maybe I didn't hit a deer.
A solid moral conflict in its own right, but Clint Eastwood pushes the stakes even further by introducing a number of other complicating factors that will make you feel absolutely cornered by the end of it. Like, I almost had to remind myself that I wasn't actually guilty and that I was just watching a movie. Which I think also proves just how successful Juror 2 was in depicting that conscience is not an outcome of reason. It is more like an emotion that is embedded within the body. One that, when faced with an impossible moral dilemma, starts eating away at you as if you're trapped in some terrible nightmare. And it was at this point that I also felt like the thematic focus started to subtly shift in a way that to me elevated the movie to even greater heights. Because when there simply is no correct answer, no one outcome that could be considered morally or even just pragmatically right, then the question, as Juror 2 so viscerally provokes, becomes more about what good we are willing to sacrifice. Or inversely, what kind of evil we are willing to invite into our lives and into our society, and what evil we just cannot bear, regardless of the consequences. Small things like these, directed by Tim Millions and starring Cillian Murphy, presented another fascinating morality tale that really grabbed me. If I had to reduce it to the plot, I'd say it's a story about a working-class father in the 1980s who learns about the abuse of young women that's going on in the convent that governs much of his community.
If you want to get on in this life, there are things you have to ignore.
But before this movie even crystallizes this moral conflict, it had already drawn me in by its immaculate sense of mood and atmosphere. It reminded me a bit of the work of Bela Tarr. There's a quietness, a bleakness, but also a strange kind of beauty underpinning every moment. I found it to be absolutely hypnotizing. Really one of those movies where you'd almost wish it didn't end so you could just stay in its world a little longer. I also really connected to the main character here and the way we are introduced to his dilemma, not by means of dread or complicity or those other more suspenseful elements that Juror 2 so effectively wielded. No, instead, the main emotion here, at least as I experienced it, was a much more sorrowful one. Like, it presents you with this world where so many are being mistreated, so many are suffering, and it filters all that through a soul who can't quite seem to deal with it, can't quite seem to accept why he has been blessed in ways that others are not. Him being a father to like 4 or 5 daughters also plays an important role here, as the safety and comfort and love he is able to extend to them stands in painful contrast with the less fortunate girls he is continuously confronted with at the convent.
Our girls will never go through what those girls are going through.
What if it was one of ours?
Oh God, isn't that what I'm saying? They're not our girls.
It beautifully explores the tension between accepting that we can't save the entire world while also not fully closing ourselves off to it, not fully resigning ourselves to the pain of others. Especially when, deep down, we secretly know that we can do more, that maybe we should do more. About 2 weeks ago, I watched the Canadian movie Red Rooms, and I'm still reeling from it. It starts off as what feels like a commentary on true crime and our morbid curiosity for it, but gradually it transforms into this deeper and much darker exploration of the ravages left behind by the digital age, which has been feeding our worst impulses while also slowly hollowing out every shred of human decency and dignity. As I said, I'm still kind of digesting this one, and perhaps with more time I'd have given it a firmer place on this list. But for now I'm going to leave it as an honorary mention and move on to what to me is 2024's definitive movie on moral decay and human evil. Jonathan Glazer's The Zone of Interest. I almost forgot to include this movie in my list, not because I failed to remember it, but in some ways the opposite, because it feels like it has already carved out its place in my long-term memory so decisively that it already feels timeless in my mind. A lot has been said about the Zone of Interest's filmmaking approach, especially the sound editing, which I still think is where the movie draws its real sense of horror from. Just that constant presence of atrocity and complicity, that complete and total entanglement of unfathomable human suffering in the banality of the everyday. But the thing that has me convinced that The Zone of Interest truly is one of the greats, a movie that I believe will stand the test of time, is the way in which its central conceit, its core idea, has already proven itself to be of incredible value in providing both a gut-wrenching insight into the dynamics of human evil, as well as an articulation of how we can name it and talk about it. Not just in the historical context of the movie's setting, but also in the here and now. As I put it in my own letterboxd review of the movie, where does our zone of interest end and what really lies behind it? What darkness are we hiding behind rose-covered walls? What evils are we casually ignoring, even though its cries permeate our everyday waking existence? I think these are questions that are of vital importance, both in the context of currently ongoing conflicts, which Glazer spoke so bravely about in his speech at the Oscars, as well as when it comes to the more general notion of a society and the way it allows people to enjoy an ideal of civilization while looking away from the hidden cruelty that is intrinsically bound up with it. About Dry Grasses, directed by Nuri Bilge Ceylan, is a giant, almost 3.5-hour movie about the pettiest of human behaviors. And it was mesmerizing. The story is centered around Samet, a disillusioned art teacher nearing the end of his mandatory service in a remote village, who becomes entangled in a controversy when he is accused of inappropriate contact with a student. It quickly becomes clear, however, that the accusation is mostly smoke and mirrors and that it's mostly a catalyst for what about Dry Grasses is ultimately most interested in, which is a meticulous character study of a well-intentioned yet ultimately conflicted man. Because Samet is a character of subtle contradictions. A man who genuinely identifies with higher ideals, yet also often finds himself acting on lesser ones. A man who is genuinely moved by humanity, yet also tends to see himself as better than those around him. Even his voiceover, sparse as it is used, becomes a false narration in this sense, giving voice to aspirations rather than to what is actually so. And yet the movie is not a simple condemnation, rather it invites you, as confrontational as this can be, to use it as a mirror, to examine the unexamined and find some truth within the artifice of your own being. There's this one scene in particular that I want to mention, a simple dinner scene towards the end in which Nure, a woman who Samet gets to know, starts arguing with him and exposing all his hypocrisies.
Evet, benden uzak olsun, bana dokunmasın da diye düşünüyorsun.
Öyle düşünsem ne olur? Yok mu hakkım? İlla herkes kahraman mı olmak zorunda?
Değil tabii ama bildiğimiz bencilliğin ılımlaştırılmış halinden bahsediyorsun. Dünyanın akıldan, eşitlikten, vicdandan uzaklaşmış bir yerde olmasının sebebi de bu değil mi bile?
It's a long sequence of just two people talking, and it was one of the most engrossing things I've watched all year. Like a Dostoevsky novel coming to life. Again, being well over 3 hours, the movie might demand a lot of your patience, but to me it was absolutely worth it. For the next movie on this list, imagine, if you will, a Cloud Atlas directed by David Lynch with a dash of French art house filmmaking. I think that will give you some idea of what it was like to watch The Beast by Bertrand Bonello.
What is stronger? Your fear or your love for me?
The Beast is a movie as enigmatic as this subject it seeks to understand. It takes place in the near future where AIs seem to govern much of humanity and where they have this technology to reach back into people's past lives to purify them from lingering trauma. Which sounds nice, but it quickly raises the question to what extent it's just a nice way of essentially handing out a sort of emotional lobotomy. Our main character, played amazingly by Lea Seydoux, tries it anyways, which is how we are presented with the other storylines. An early 20th century costume drama about an ill-fated love affair, and an early 21st century story about a model encountering a violent incel. Played very boldly here by George McKay.
And my problem is girls.
I mean, if you know, you know. Connecting all of them is The Beast, which is not an actual thing, but which kind of hangs over the story and its characters like a shadow lurking just outside of the frame. It's the nebulous feeling existing somewhere on the intersection of loneliness, fear, and that strange sense of impending doom that seems to be at once the source and result of our existential suffering. It adds a certain cosmic dimension to the more particular conflicts of each individual storyline, to paint a more all-encompassing portrait of the human condition, not just to underline its despair and futility, but also to emphasize its yearning and hope in spite of these things, in spite of the beast. It's not a movie I can claim to fully understand, not even after seeing it a second time, but I kind of like that about it, the way it challenges the audience and the way it doesn't offer a clear answer or statement, but rather gives you this intricate and creatively crafted journey through past, present, and future, the exact meaning of which, in part at least, depends on your own investment, your own willingness to take that leap in the same way that the characters, in all their uncertainty, still keep reaching out to each other. Going even deeper into the David Lynch vibes, we find I Saw the TV Glow, which at first glance feels like a fever dream plowing the collective unconsciousness of the millennial generation. It is highly unconventional, otherworldly and opaque, but also contains a certain raw emotion, a mood and atmosphere that connected with me beyond what I consciously understood about the actual story. Directed by James Schoenbrunn, who is a transgender filmmaker, I Saw the TV Glow feels like a very personal story about Schoenbrunn's own experience and struggle with gender identity. But I appreciated how it wasn't an obvious allegory, like there's a lot here that symbolically applies to themes of queerness and gender identity, which is something that LGBT people will probably be able to speak more eloquently about than I can. But for me, the part that I connected with and what I really admired about this movie was how it dug deeper towards those more universal emotions below the surface. Feelings of alienation, of melancholy, of not really knowing who you are or what you want. It's also about the dynamics of nostalgia, of escapism, and of finding some part of you outside of yourself, and hauntingly captures the tragedy of not being able to hold on to it.
Those memories were put there to distract you, to keep you trapped.
It's been a few months since I saw the movie, and even though it tested my patience at times and I didn't quite get everything about it, it nevertheless struck a chord that still resonates with me to this day. Like it went over my head to instead tap into some deeper part of myself I didn't even know was there. And that's a pretty rare experience and a beautiful testament to the way movies can kind of sneak up on you, bring you into motion in unexpected ways, and sort of nestle their way into your subconscious. It's just a very special thing and a good note to end this cinematic year on. Well, actually, I had one more honorable mention for you that's streaming exclusively on Mubi, where you can now also access your yearly personalized retrospective. A sort of celebratory reflection where you can see what type of movie lover you are and get some interesting recommendations based on your movie watching habits. Among my accolades was the modernist, someone who prefers watching recent releases. And I guess I did watch quite a few newer movies on Mubi this year, including the one that I wanted to share with you, and that's My First Film, directed by Zia Anger, which is a kind of meta-reflection about a director recounting her first project, a movie that she ultimately abandoned. What fascinated me so much here was the full embrace of the 21st century in the sense that it incorporated a variety of modern elements like smartphones, computer screens, and consumer cameras to enrich the movie's cinematic language in a meaningful way. It's just a very creative movie and a great example of the many cinematic riches that Mubi has to offer. So be sure to use my personal link to get the extended free trial, that's mubi.com/likestoriesofold, to get 30 days of great cinema for free. Lastly, as always, I want to take a moment to thank everyone for your continued support, not just in this year, but in all of them. I still can't believe I've been allowed to do this for as long as I have. Every year still feels like a blessing, and each year my gratitude only deepens, especially considering how I'm still so excited to make these videos for all of you. Like, I already have so many ideas for next year. After that behemoth that was the top 50 video, I want to go back to the roots for a bit, just some concise and critical analyses of meaningful storytelling. But next year might also be the year that I'm taking another big step. I can't make an official statement yet on this one, there's a lot of factors here outside of my control, but after years of analyzing the stories of others, I might finally create one of my own. But you know, let's keep that between us for now. In the meantime, I wish you all Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and I look forward to seeing you all again in 2025.